Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the peril of childbirth in medieval Europe, when the bringing of life was so often shadowed by the presence of death. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honour, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. In those centuries now long faded, the act of childbirth was more feared than any battlefield wound. Women knew, from the moment their bellies began to swell, that they were entering a trial where survival was uncertain. Parish records across Europe bear grim witness, listing countless young wives who never rose again from their birthing beds. For every family, no matter its station, the looming question was whether the mother would live to cradle her child. This shadow of mortality lay heavy upon hearth and hall alike. The danger was not whispered but openly acknowledged, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Husbands prepared wills for their wives before labour, and neighbours crossed themselves at the sound of a woman's cries. Chroniclers in monasteries noted the frequency with which noble ladies vanished in childbirth, a fate that no riches could prevent. Even the great castles, adorned with banners and stone, could not bar death's entry. The knowledge that every pregnancy might end in mourning gave a certain quiet to even the most joyous announcements. When I recall the faces of those times, I see the lines of fear etched into them. A young bride might enter her new home with a smile, but once her courses stopped, her countenance grew grave. Older women, already touched by loss, would comfort her with words, yet in their eyes was the memory of sisters and mothers lost. It was a collective grief passed from one generation to another, shaping how life itself was understood. Birth and death were not distant, but entwined. Those who survived often carried scars both in body and in spirit. Pelvic injuries, fevers, and long recoveries left many weakened, less able to labour in fields or halls. Some widowed men remarried swiftly, seeking not romance but survival, for infants could rarely be raised alone. The mortality of women was thus tied to the very structure of society, influencing inheritance, alliances, and even the destinies of kingdoms. To marry was to gamble not only with love, but with life. It strikes me how different it is from our own age, where a wound of the flesh might frighten a man, yet childbirth was the more lethal trial. The battlefield was a place one could choose, but for women, the duty was imposed by nature and by expectation. No sword nor shield could protect them from what lay ahead. I have seen warriors falter before death, yet the quiet courage of women walking into that peril was no less noble. Their valour was of another kind, silent and unseen. Every village and town bore witness to this cycle. Midwives carried not only herbs and cloths, but also the weight of knowing they could not always save those entrusted to them. Bells tolled often for the departed, their sound mingling with the first cries of infants who might themselves not survive. Death was not an intruder in these moments. It was a familiar guest at the threshold. Life began with its shadow close at hand, reminding all of the fragility that bound existence. Some families kept tokens of remembrance, a lock of hair, a carved wooden cross, a prayer inscribed on parchment. These small relics were held close, for they bore the presence of those lost in the moment of giving life. I have seen such tokens tucked in psalters, worn thin by fingers in prayer. They were not only objects of grief, but of reverence, for they spoke of sacrifice. To remember these women was to honour both their suffering and their strength. Even now, as the fire flickers low before me, I cannot think on those times without a quiet heaviness. The chronicles speak in numbers, yet behind each number was a face, a voice, a hope. The ever-present shadow of death at childbirth was not merely a fact of history. It was a shaping force upon all who lived in those centuries. To understand their world, one must feel that wait, how joy and dread walk together, whenever new life stirred in the womb. The knowledge upon which healers leaned in those days was drawn from ancient texts, more philosophy than science. Galen's humours ruled the thinking of physicians, who measured health by the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they believed, came from imbalance, not infection. Astrology too was consulted, for the stars were thought to guide the fate of the body as surely as they did the heavens. Such beliefs held great authority, though they could not save a woman in distress. I recall the silence of physicians when asked to attend births. These men, trained in Latin and cloistered in universities, often avoided the birthing room. They considered childbirth beneath their station, a matter for women to manage. Midwives, with their herbs and hands, were left to confront the peril alone. The physician's scrolls spoke of distant theories, but offered little to the mother groaning in pain. Thus, the gulf between knowledge and necessity widened with every generation. The body of a woman in labour was poorly understood. Dissection was rare and often forbidden, so anatomy remained cloaked in mystery. The womb was spoken of in allegories, compared to vessels or furnaces, but seldom observed with accuracy. What today seems clear, the dangers of hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed passage, was then hidden by ignorance. Each life lost was a testimony to what was not known. It was as if women bore not only their children, but also the weight of medical blindness. Superstition often filled the void where knowledge failed. A difficult labour might be blamed on the alignment of Mars or on a curse whispered by an enemy. Remedies could include prayers, charms, or the burning of herbs whose fumes were believed to chase away malign forces. Sometimes, these practices offered comfort. At other times, they deepened the despair. Yet in a world without understanding of germs or sanitation, belief itself became a form of medicine, fragile though it was. What I observed then was not cruelty, but limitation. Learned men recited Aristotle and Hippocrates, yet lacked the instruments to see what truly caused suffering. Without microscopes, the unseen world remained hidden, and without surgical skill, many deaths could not be prevented. It humbles me to reflect upon their certainty, spoken with such authority, when their words could not halt a single fatal fever. Their cloaks and books impressed, but their hands were of little use to labouring women. For the common folk, this gap in knowledge was felt most bitterly. A peasant's wife had no access to scrolls, no chance of distant remedies. She relied upon tradition passed from grandmother to daughter, practices untested yet clung to with hope. Even noble women, who might summon physicians in moments of dire need, discovered that their presence rarely altered fate. Across all ranks, women entered childbirth armed with courage, but seldom with the shield of true medical aid. It is easy to imagine the weight of helplessness that hung over every birth. To know that wisdom existed in words, but not in practice, must have been a torment for those who sought answers. Families turned to God when knowledge failed, for the church seemed the only source of certainty. In that surrender lay both solace and resignation. Faith gave strength where medicine faltered, yet it also reminded all of the frailty of human reason. Looking back, I see that the lack of medical knowledge was as dangerous as any sword on the battlefield. The battlefield claimed men who chose to stand in its path, but ignorance claimed women who had no choice at all. The trust they placed in midwives, in charms, or in prayer was born of necessity, not folly. Their courage was greater for walking into danger with so little aid, a reminder that survival itself was once the highest form of triumph. In the villages and towns where I once passed, the figure of the midwife was as constant as the church bell or the village well. She was the one called when the pains began, summoned in haste through narrow streets or muddy fields. Her hands bore the wisdom of many births, though that wisdom was not written, but lived. The survival of mother and child often rested upon her judgment, and so she was both trusted and feared. Few women gave birth without her presence. The midwife's tools were simple, cloths, oils, and herbs gathered from meadow and forest. She carried in her memory a catalogue of remedies: sage to steady, rue to hasten, lavender to soothe. Yet her work was not only of plants, but of prayer. She invoked saints and recited psalms, mingling faith with medicine. The line between healing and ritual was thin, for in the face of danger, every aid was welcomed. To many, she seemed to stand halfway between earth and heaven. Yet with that power came suspicion. When outcomes were tragic, whispers grew. Some claimed the midwife had erred. Others accused her of meddling in forbidden arts. In times of plague or famine, it was easy for frightened villagers to point to the woman whose knowledge set her apart. Many endured accusations of witchcraft, their skill seen as unnatural by those who could not understand it. Thus, their service brought both respect and peril, a burden heavy to bear. Among the noble, midwives too found their place, though often under stricter watch. Queens and ladies required attendants whose loyalty could be trusted, for the fate of dynasties rested in the cradle. Records tell of midwives granted privileges, their names noted beside royal births. Yet even within palaces, they stood vulnerable. If a queen died, blame might fall upon them, and honor could swiftly turn to disgrace. To serve in such chambers was as dangerous as it was prestigious. Some midwives trained apprentices, passing their knowledge quietly from one generation to another. Daughters, nieces, or neighbors watched and learned, building a chain of experience that stretched across centuries. This was education, not of parchment, but of practice, born in the cries of laboring women and the silence of loss. What survived was preserved in memory, fragile as a whispered prayer. In their hands lay the closest thing to medical tradition most women would ever know. I often marveled at their endurance. They entered homes at all hours, through storm or frost, carrying neither sword nor shield, yet meeting danger face to face. Their battlefield was the birthing bed, their victory measured in cries of new life. When I beheld their work, I could not help but see a kind of knightly courage, one without armor, yet no less honorable. The strength of their calling was carved in the lives they touched. It is true that their remedies were not always effective, but they offered more than medicine. They gave presence, reassurance, and the sense that women were not alone in their hour of peril. A hand held tightly, a calm word spoken, could steady fear when pain seemed unendurable. In a world where death was expected, comfort itself became a form of healing. The midwife was as much a guardian of spirit as of flesh. Their memory lingers still, not in grand chronicles, but in the quiet gratitude of those they helped. Without them, countless more lives would have been lost to ignorance and despair. Though history sometimes accused them unjustly, it was through their skill and compassion that many survived. The central role of midwives was not an accident of necessity, but a pillar of medieval life, woven deeply into the fabric of survival and hope. In the Middle Ages, the birthing room was not a chamber of medicine, but the hearth itself. Women labored in their own houses, surrounded by the sights and smells of daily life. Smoke from the fire mixed with the cries of labor, and the same floor upon which meals were prepared became the ground of life and death. There were no sterile halls nor clean sheets, only what the family could muster from their humble stores. This was the setting in which nearly every child drew its first breath. The presence of neighbors and kin was customary, for birth was as much a communal event as it was private. Mothers, sisters, and friends crowded into the room, lending both encouragement and pressure. Their murmured prayers mingled with the moans of the laboring woman, a chorus of hope and fear. Yet the crowd carried its dangers, for each unwashed hand and each reused cloth increased the chance of infection. What seemed like support often brought hidden peril into the chamber. For peasants, the dwelling itself was a poor defense against illness. Damp walls, smoke-filled air, and floors of earth provided little comfort. Animals sometimes shared the same roof, their presence adding to the unhygienic state. In such places, childbirth unfolded amidst roughness, a natural act in a setting unprepared for its risks. The vulnerability of mothers was heightened by the very conditions in which they lived, where survival was already a daily contest. Even in noble households, where wealth softened discomfort, danger still lingered. Rich fabrics and warm fires could not guard against the unseen foes that caused fevers or bleeding. The great halls of castles echoed with the same cries as cottages, though veiled by tapestries and silks. Queens and ladies lay vulnerable, their attendants as powerless as the neighbours of a peasant wife. The home, whether grand or modest, remained unfit for the struggle that childbirth demanded. The atmosphere of these births was shaped by both faith and fear. Crosses were hung on walls, relics placed beneath pillows, and candles blessed by priests lit the space. These small sanctuaries were created within the home to push back against the uncertainty that loomed over every delivery. To the families, they were fortresses of prayer against the approach of death. Yet even surrounded by such devotion, many women did not rise again from their beds. When tragedy struck, the house itself bore the memory. A room that had been filled with the scent of herbs and the voices of neighbours became a place of mourning. The bed where life was expected to bloom now stood as a witness to loss. Families often kept vigil within those same walls, their grief echoing where joy had been hoped for. In such moments, the home became a vessel carrying both beginnings and endings. I cannot forget how central the home was in shaping these experiences. There was no separation of life's greatest transitions. Birth, sickness, and death all took place beneath the same roof. The boundaries we now know between hospital, church, and dwelling were absent. Everything was contained within the walls of daily existence, fragile and intimate. To step into a medieval home during childbirth was to step into a space where life and death wrestled in close quarters. Reflecting upon it now, I see how these homes, humble or noble, bore the weight of countless untold stories. Their walls heard the first cries of infants and the final sighs of mothers. They were both cradle and coffin, sanctified not by safety, but by necessity. Childbirth at home was not a choice, but the only path, and its legacy remains written in the silence of those rooms long emptied of voices. From the pulpits of stone churches, the voices of priests often reminded women that their suffering in childbirth was no accident, but a divine decree. They spoke of Eve's disobedience, the ancient tale that bound all daughters of her lineage to pain as punishment. Thus, the cries of labour were not only endured, but sanctified, turned into proof of obedience to God's order. This belief pressed upon mothers a spiritual duty, transforming agony into a kind of offering at the altar of faith. The church offered its presence in many forms, for even priests who never entered the birthing room left their mark upon it. Holy water was sprinkled upon pillows, relics of saints laid close to the mother's body, and prayers recited as contractions grew stronger. The words of Scripture, repeated again and again, sought to lift fear by promising eternal reward. In this mingling of devotion and desperation, pain itself became both burden and path towards salvation. Women turned particularly to saints who were believed to understand their peril. Saint Margaret of Antioch was most often invoked, her legend telling of her survival after being swallowed by a dragon and cast out alive. Her victory over that monstrous trial seemed to echo the hope of emerging from childbirth with life preserved. Small images of her were carried, her name whispered in gasps between waves of pain. Faith in her intercession offered courage when flesh was failing. Other saints too found places in the birthing chamber. Saint Anne, mother of the Virgin Mary, was honoured as a matron who had borne life with grace. Saint Bridget was prayed to in the aisles, her name tied to blessings of fertility and safe passage. These figures stood as heavenly companions for women who could not look to physicians for assurance. Each saint's story was woven into the prayers of countless mothers as they struggled toward delivery. Not all comforts were found in relics or blessings. The presence of clergy sometimes added to fear, for their arrival could signal the nearness of death. If a priest entered to offer the last rites, the cries of pain turned to cries of dread, for it meant hope was slipping away. In those moments, the line between birth and funeral blurred. Families prayed more urgently, clinging to faith even as sorrow pressed heavily upon the chamber. I remember how often women accepted their fate with quiet resignation, believing their suffering was divinely ordained. They bore it with a patience born of piety, their hands clutching rosaries as tightly as the sheets beneath them. Though anguish tore through their bodies, they believed each pang was not wasted but sanctified. It was an outlook that brought both strength and sorrow, for it left little room to question why so many lives were claimed so swiftly. Even so, faith could be a shield against despair. A whispered blessing from a priest, the touch of a cross upon the forehead, or the soft chanting of psalms could steady trembling hearts. In a world where medicine faltered, religion gave form to suffering, making it part of a greater story. Whether one survived or not, the belief that God's hand was present offered meaning to what otherwise seemed senseless loss. Thus, labor in those centuries was more than a physical trial, it was a spiritual journey. Women were told they walked the path of Eve, yet also bore within them the hope of Mary. Their pain was framed as punishment and redemption all at once, shaping how every birth was understood. In the flicker of candles and the shadow of crucifixes, childbirth became not merely the bringing forth of life, but an act that bound body and soul to heaven's decree. There was a danger in those times that none could see, yet it struck with a swiftness more feared than any sword. Within days of delivering a child, a woman who had survived the trial of labor could be seized by fever. Her skin burned, her body trembled, and her strength drained until life itself slipped away. We know this now as puerperal fever, but in those centuries it was a mystery, an invisible assassin moving silently through chambers of joy. I recall how such fevers were often blamed upon foul air or divine judgment. Families believed the sickness drifted from the damp walls, or that spirits had entered the home. In truth, it was the hands of those who aided, the unwashed cloths, the reused tools, the touch of one already soiled by other tasks, that spread the death. Yet no one could grasp the cause, and so superstition filled the silence left by ignorance. Hope turned quickly to lamentation. The swiftness of this fever made it all the more cruel. A mother who had cradled her child for a brief moment could be gone before the week had ended. Infants, left without nourishment, were often unable to survive on their own. Families found themselves mourning two lives at once, the bed where new life had begun becoming the place of double loss. This sorrow echoed in every parish, filling graveyards with mothers scarcely older than brides. Even among the noble, with their wealth and attendance, no safeguard proved strong enough. Queens and ladies of renown fell victim as swiftly as the humblest peasant. The court might summon physicians, but their potions and bleedings did little to stem the fire that consumed from within. Chronicles record the deaths of royal women, their loss-shaking kingdoms, reminding all that death paid no heed to titles. It was an enemy that spared neither palace nor cottage. Midwives carried the burden of this unseen peril most heavily. Though they worked tirelessly to bring life safely into the world, they were powerless against the fever that followed. Some were accused of negligence, others of witchcraft, as if their touch had summoned the illness. In truth, they too grieved the women lost under their care, yet had no means to change the course of fate. Their role was as tragic as it was necessary. I have seen how despair spread when fever struck a household. The joy of baptism and celebration was stilled, the singing of neighbors replaced with mourning songs. Candles that had burned for blessing were lit again for funeral vigils. What was meant to be a season of new beginnings became a season of grief, reshaping the lives of husbands, children, and kin. Death's swiftness was a reminder that joy in those days was always shadowed by fear. Archaeological studies of cemeteries reveal the truth of these accounts. Graves hold the remains of women who died in their prime, often buried with their infants. The earth itself bears witness to the frequency of this silent killer. These findings confirm what chronicles and letters spoke of with sorrow, that childbirth did not end with the child's arrival, but carried dangers that lingered long after. It was a trial that stretched beyond the moment of labor, unseen and unrelenting. Looking back across those centuries, I see how helpless they were against this foe. Today, we know it was spread by hands unwashed and cloths unclean. Yet to them, it was a curse with no face. Their prayers rose with fervor, but still the fever claimed many. In that helplessness lies the deepest truth of medieval childbirth. Survival was never assured, even after the cries of the newborn filled the room. The fire of life burned precariously, at the mercy of what they could not see. Few things struck with such terror as the sudden flow of blood after birth. A woman might endure long hours of labor, her strength nearly spent, only for her life to slip away in moments once the child had come. There were no transfusions, no surgeons skilled to intervene, only frantic hands pressing cloths and whispered prayers. The brightness of new life was darkened by the crimson flood, leaving families helpless before nature's cruelty. It was a peril known to all, yet none knew how to prevent it. The remedies available were little more than fragile attempts to hold back death. Herbal teas of nettle or yarrow were brewed, compresses of wool soaked in wine pressed upon the body. Some burned incense to drive out unseen forces. Others applied cold stones upon the abdomen. Though born of care and hope, these practices rarely altered the course once bleeding began. The speed of the loss often left no time even for the priest to arrive with last rites. Chroniclers recorded with sober clarity the suddenness of such deaths. A noble woman might be seen smiling moments after delivery, only to fall pale and lifeless before her attendants' eyes. Peasant wives, too, collapsed in their cottages, leaving behind infants crying for milk that could no longer be given. Monastic scribes noted these tragedies in their ledgers, sometimes writing only a name and the brief words, "died in childbed." By tribe, such records reveal the commonness of sorrow, stark and unembellished. Even kings and lords feared this outcome for their wives, for dynasties hung upon the survival of heirs. Queens such as Isabella of Aragon and Eleanor of Castile bore many children, yet their lives ended in the aftermath of childbirth. Their deaths reshaped alliances and altered the course of kingdoms, proving that hemorrhage was not a private grief alone, but a matter that shook nations. The fate of empires could hinge upon the strength of a woman's body. In villages, widowers often remarried quickly, not from lack of mourning, but from necessity. Infants without mothers faced peril, and households needed women to tend hearth and field alike. Blood loss in childbirth thus rippled outward, affecting not only the family, but the survival of entire communities. It was a reminder that the body of each woman bore both personal and collective weight, for her health meant the continuation of lives beyond her own. There were those who tried to find meaning in the suffering, believing that such deaths were part of divine will. Priests spoke of sacrifice, comparing the spilling of maternal blood to Christ's passion. These words offered comfort to some, yet they also deepened the sense of inevitability. Few dared to question why such pain was allowed, for to challenge fate was to challenge faith. Thus, resignation became a form of endurance, binding sorrow into the rhythm of life. I cannot forget the look in the eyes of those who stood by as blood poured forth, powerless to stop it. Their grief was mingled with bewilderment, for nothing in their knowledge could alter what unfolded. To lose a woman in such a way left scars not only in memory, but in trust itself. Each new birth thereafter was haunted by the fear that joy might again be overturned in an instant, as if life itself were a fragile bargain. Hemorrhage was among the clearest proofs of the limits of medieval healing. No wealth, no prayer, no herb held certain power against it. It came swiftly, cruelly, and without respect for station. Those who lived carried the memory as a shadow over every future birth. In recalling it now, I see how fragile human life was in those centuries, balanced on the edge of survival, where blood itself could be both the source of life and the cause of its end. There were labors that stretched not for hours, but for days, where every cry of the mother grew weaker and every effort of those around her more desperate. Obstructed birth was among the most feared of trials, for when the child could not pass, both mother and infant were trapped in agony. Midwives tried shifting positions, pressing upon the body, or whispering prayers to saints, but too often nothing availed. The waiting turned to dread, for all knew that time itself was the enemy. Malnutrition left its mark on the bodies of many women. Crooked bones from rickets or narrow pelvises from childhood hunger often made delivery near impossible. These were not burdens chosen, but inherited from the hardships of daily survival. The poverty of a girl's youth might seal the fate of her womanhood, creating obstacles unseen until the hour of labor. Thus, childbirth bore the scars of social conditions as much as of nature, binding body and hunger together in tragedy. In those centuries, surgical knowledge was almost absent from the birthing chamber. The idea of cutting to save a living woman was rarely conceived, for it was believed certain death would follow. Instead, mothers endured the ordeal until their strength failed, leaving attendants helpless to intervene. Some records speak of labor lasting 3 or 4 days, the cries filling the house until silence fell. These silences were remembered for generations, etched into the hearts of those left behind. There are grim accounts of embryotomy, where instruments were used to remove a child piece by piece when no other option remained. Such measures were desperate attempts to preserve the life of the mother, though even then survival was uncertain. The very mention of these procedures in medieval manuscripts reveals the extremity of the danger. They were spoken of rarely with reluctance, for they carried both horror and shame. Yet they show the lengths to which midwives and physicians sometimes went. Among the noble, these dangers were no less severe. Chronicles tell of duchesses and queens whose lives ended after days of obstructed labor. Their deaths disrupted dynasties, bringing grief not only to families, but to entire realms. In the courts of Europe, the fate of an heir could be destroyed by such a trial. Thrones trembled because a child could not be delivered, reminding all that power itself bent before the limits of the human body. I have walked through villages where the memory of such losses still lingered in the words of widowers and mothers-in-law. They told of women whose faces grew gaunt from endless effort, their breath shallow as prayers rose around them. Children born still, mothers carried to graves, families shattered in a single ordeal. These were stories repeated until they became warnings to every young bride. Fear was not abstract, but personal, handed down in the very fabric of daily life. The helplessness of those attending cannot be overstated. Midwives, though seasoned by experience, knew when their skills met an immovable wall. Their hands could not widen bone nor undo deformity. They stayed nonetheless, holding, praying, offering what comfort they could. That courage, though powerless to alter the outcome, was itself an act of devotion. It showed that in the face of impossible odds, presence and compassion still mattered, even when life could not be preserved. Reflecting on these ordeals, I see how they shaped the medieval understanding of destiny. When a woman and child perished together, it was often spoken of as God's will, a trial no human could avert. Yet behind such words lay grief too deep to name, a recognition of the fragility of existence. Difficult and obstructed labor stood as one of the clearest reminders of mortality's hold over every household, whether in peasant's cottage or royal palace. There was a practice spoken of in hushed tones, used not to save mothers, but to salvage what could be taken after their passing. The caesarean, as we know it now, was in the Middle Ages reserved almost entirely for women who had already breathed their last. It was not an act of mercy for the mother, but a desperate attempt to draw forth the child, or at the very least to ensure its baptism before burial. Death surrounded the act from its very beginning. The law of the Church played a powerful role in this decision. It was believed that an unbaptized infant could not enter heaven, and so priests and families pressed for the cutting of the mother's body if she had died in labor. The urgency was spiritual rather than medical, a race against the fading moments of life. Midwives and clerics alike were compelled to attempt the procedure, for the salvation of a soul was considered worth any act of severity. The operation itself was brutal and offered no hope for the woman. Without knowledge of antisepsis, without instruments fit for such work, it was little more than a tearing open of the womb. When the mother was already gone, there was no concern for her suffering, but if the procedure were attempted upon the living, it nearly always brought death within hours. The notion of survival through such means was beyond their comprehension, a future medicine yet to be imagined. Records of these acts exist in chronicles and in canon law, for the Church insisted that no child be buried within the mother's body. The separation was demanded, not only for the soul of the child, but to maintain the dignity of Christian burial. Thus, gravediggers and priests sometimes stood witness as the body of a young woman was opened, her child lifted into uncertain life or prepared for baptism before death. It was a ritual as much as an operation. In noble households, such moments were steeped in politics as well as sorrow. The heir of a throne might be claimed from the womb of a lifeless queen, his birth both a tragedy and a necessity. The death of Jeanne of Navarre in 1349 is one such account, where dynastic hopes depended upon survival beyond the grave. These stories show that the caesarean was not merely about salvation of souls, but about the continuation of bloodlines and the stability of kingdoms. The peasants too faced this practice, though with fewer hands to perform it. In their cottages, the procedure was cruder still, done with knives used for daily tasks. If the child lived long enough for water to be poured over its head, the act was considered a success, even if death soon followed. Such scenes reveal the depth of fear that unbaptized innocence inspired, as well as the extremes to which families would go in the hope of eternal safety. The memory of these operations lingered in communities as grim tales. Women who entered childbirth feared not only the ordeal itself, but what might be done to them should they not survive. Their bodies were no longer their own once life departed, becoming vessels for the salvation of another. This knowledge weighed heavily, turning joy into dread long before the first pangs of labor began. It is no wonder that prayers rose louder at such times. When I recall these practices, I see how fragile and desperate life was in those centuries. Caesarean sections were not pathways to healing, but echoes of tragedy, born of faith and fear entwined. They remind us that medieval childbirth was haunted not only by the risk of death, but by the rituals demanded after it. The procedure stands as a stark witness to the limits of their medicine and the depth of their belief in salvation beyond the grave. Amidst the uncertainty of childbirth, families often turned to objects and rituals that promised unseen protection. Amulets were tied around the necks of laboring women, small pouches filled with herbs, bones, or bits of parchment inscribed with sacred words. Knots were tied in threads or cords, believed to bind evil spirits and keep them from interfering with delivery. These customs were woven into daily life, a mixture of ancient folk practices and the teachings of the Church. They were fragile defenses against forces they could not control. I remember seeing relics of saints passed from hand to hand, pressed against swollen bellies in the hope of easing the path of birth. The faithful clutched rosaries and kissed crosses, believing that divine power could move through objects as readily as through prayers. Sometimes women drank water in which a relic had been dipped, trusting it carried blessing into their very bodies. The blending of the holy with the physical was natural, for the line between faith and medicine was scarcely drawn. Folk beliefs were no less powerful in the countryside. Women carried iron keys at their waists, thinking the strength of metal might unlock the womb. Charms were placed above doors or windows to prevent malevolent spirits from entering during labor. Midwives whispered incantations passed down from their grandmothers, words that mingled Christian invocations with remnants of older pagan traditions. These gestures gave comfort, for to act against danger felt better than to stand idle before it. There were also practices shaped by fear of the devil's interference. Some believed witches sought to harm newborns, and so charms were placed in cradles before the child even arrived. Salt was sprinkled in corners of the room. Candles kept burning through the night to chase away shadows. Every sound outside was met with suspicion, every flicker of flame interpreted as a sign. In such moments, the unseen world seemed to press very close to the fragile threshold of life. The church sometimes condemned these practices, calling them superstition and urging trust in God alone. Yet priests also distributed blessed candles, holy water, and protective prayers, which to the people looked little different from charms. This mingling of sanctioned faith with forbidden custom reveals the depth of desperation. When life was at stake, families reached for every aid, no matter how contradictory. Fear made space for both blessing and charm to exist side by side. It is striking how universal this reliance on protective objects was, from the cottages of peasants to the halls of the noble. A queen might carry a saint's relic sewn into her gown, while a village woman tied a ribbon blessed at the local shrine. Both placed their trust in small tokens, humble or grand, as if these fragile items could tip the balance of fate. The equality of fear brought all ranks closer, united in the uncertainty of childbirth. Though many of these charms had no true power, they gave women something no herb or physician could always offer: hope. The belief that one was guarded by saints or strengthened by amulets eased the terror of entering labor. Even if the outcome was unchanged, the mind found solace in the sense of being defended. In a world where knowledge was scarce, the unseen became the most trusted companion. Looking back now, I understand why these practices endured. Childbirth in those centuries was a step into the unknown, and people armed themselves with whatever strength they could find. Superstitions and protective charms were not mere folly, but reflections of the human need to feel less alone in moments of peril. They tell us much about the medieval heart, its fear, its faith, and its longing to wrestle meaning from the shadows of life and death. Among the tools of the midwife, herbs held a central place, gathered from hedgerows, fields, and monastery gardens. Plants like sage, pennyroyal, and rue were believed to influence the course of labor, either easing contractions or hastening delivery. Knowledge of their use was passed from woman to woman, a fragile chain of memory stretching across generations. These remedies reflected centuries of trial and error, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful. In them, one sees both the ingenuity and the desperation of medieval medicine. Many believed that certain plants carried mystical as well as physical power. Mugwort was tied around a woman's waist to aid birth, while juniper was burned to cleanse the air. Fennel and anise were brewed into teas to calm nerves and steady breath. The scents of these herbs filled birthing rooms, their fragrances mingling with candle smoke and sweat. Whether they truly altered the body or simply offered reassurance, they gave the laboring woman something tangible to cling to. Not all uses were safe. Pennyroyal, known to stimulate contractions, could also poison if taken in excess. Other herbs carried risks that midwives only dimly understood, for their effects varied with strength and dosage. A plant meant to quicken delivery might instead weaken the body, hastening death. These dangers were not spoken of lightly, but necessity left little choice. When no physician would come, the midwife reached for what knowledge she had, however uncertain. Monastic healers also contributed to the tradition, recording recipes in their herbals. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, for example, speak of herbs for women's ailments, blending observation with spiritual reflection. Such texts gave authority to practices already long in use among common folk. Yet even with their careful words, the remedies could not always save lives. The limits of herbs, like the limits of prayer, were clear when a woman's body faltered in labor. The reliance on plants was not confined to childbirth alone. From cradle to grave, herbs accompanied every stage of life, healing wounds, easing fevers, or preparing the dying for their final rest. In this way, childbirth fit into a larger cycle of herbal care that shaped daily existence. The same plants that flavored meals or kept pests away were summoned in times of peril. Knowledge of them was as essential to survival as bread or water. In noble houses, the use of herbs carried prestige. Skilled midwives and apothecaries prepared mixtures with rare spices brought from distant lands. Saffron, cinnamon, and myrrh might be added to strengthen potions, linking childbirth to the wealth of trade routes. Yet even in these halls of abundance, death often prevailed. The rarest herb could not overcome ignorance of infection or bleeding. Riches softened the path, but could not guard against its end. The hands of the poor relied on what the earth gave freely. Nettles, chamomile, and rosemary were gathered by the roadside, dried, and stored in simple pouches. These humble plants provided comfort, if not always cure. Their use shows how women turned to the natural world for aid, interpreting its bounty as both gift and mystery. To use herbs was to place trust in creation itself, even when outcomes remained uncertain. Looking back, I see that herbal remedies reveal the paradox of medieval life. Immense faith in the healing gifts of nature, paired with deep vulnerability to its dangers. The reliance on plants showed resilience, creativity, and hope, but also the boundaries of knowledge. In those fragile leaves and roots lay both salvation and risk, a reminder that survival was always uncertain. They stand as symbols of a world caught between wisdom and unknowing, striving to ease suffering where little could be done. The birthing room was largely closed to men, seen as a place where only women should tread. Physicians, trained in universities and draped in scholarly authority, rarely attended. Their world was one of Latin texts, distant from the cries of childbirth. To them, such matters were the domain of midwives, whose practical knowledge they often dismissed as superstition. This absence left women to face their peril mostly without the presence of those considered most learned in the healing arts. When male physicians were finally summoned, it was usually in moments of crisis, when all other efforts had failed. Their remedies, bloodletting, purges, or fumigations, were often more harmful than helpful. Without understanding anatomy or the causes of infection, they could not intervene effectively. Their arrival sometimes brought more fear than comfort, for it meant the labor had taken a dangerous turn. Families placed their hope in their authority, though outcomes rarely changed. The separation of roles was rooted in custom as well as modesty. Childbirth was considered an intimate and sacred act, to be guarded from male eyes. The honor of women, especially noble women, demanded privacy. Thus, physicians who might have brought knowledge were kept away by the very boundaries of propriety. The birthing chamber became a world of women alone, while men waited outside, anxious and powerless. What was meant as protection often deepened the dangers, yet there were exceptions, preserved in chronicles. A handful of daring physicians attempted to intervene, writing treatises that offered limited guidance. Some tried to instruct midwives, blending their university learning with practical experience. Still, their words were bound to Galenic theory and astrology, blind to the true causes of suffering. Their presence in the history of childbirth is like a faint shadow, noticed only when the light of midwives faltered. They remained outsiders in a world ruled by necessity. Among the nobility, tensions sometimes arose between midwives and court physicians. A queen in peril could draw both into the chamber, each vying for authority. If she survived, credit was taken. If she died, blame was swiftly cast. Such rivalries reveal the fragile state of medieval medicine, divided between tradition and scholarship, experience and theory. Neither side possessed the knowledge truly needed. yet both were essential in their own way. For the common woman, the absence of physicians was scarcely felt, for they could not afford such men anyway. Their lives unfolded with the guidance of midwives alone, women who had no parchment but plenty of practice. In this sense, the exclusion of physicians mattered most to the wealthy, whose hopes of safety were raised by access, yet dashed by the limits of learning. For peasants, childbirth had always been a gamble with or without scholarly presence. The exclusion also reflected the broader pattern of how women's health was regarded. Their bodies were subjects of theological debate, but rarely of medical study. Physicians wrote at length about humours and stars, yet seldom about the real conditions that claimed women's lives. In neglecting the birthing room, they neglected half of humanity's suffering. This silence in their records speaks louder than any words they penned. In my memory, the image endures of men waiting outside while the cries of labour echoed within. Their authority, so strong in other matters, faltered at that threshold. The exclusion of male physicians from childbirth was not only a cultural boundary, but a symptom of deeper ignorance. It left women to carry their burden with little aid, while men of learning stood apart, unknowing of the blood and sorrow that shaped the heart of family life. For women in medieval Europe, life was marked by an almost unending cycle of conception, birth, and nursing. From the moment of marriage, their bodies were expected to bear children, often one after another, with little pause between. Contraception was scarce and condemned, so fertility was rarely interrupted by choice. A woman's adult years became a succession of pregnancies, each carrying the same shadow of danger. Survival meant stepping back into risk, again and again, until her body could endure no more. Noble women bore this burden as much as peasant wives, though for different reasons. In castles, dynasties depended upon heirs, pressing queens and ladies into repeated pregnancies. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, is said to have borne 16 children, her life spent between the cradle and the birthing bed. Though surrounded by wealth, she still faced the same dangers, proving that status offered little shield. Inheritance and power demanded constant reproduction, no matter the toll. For peasant women, the demand was survival rather than lineage. Large families meant more hands to work the fields, more children to replace those lost to famine or disease. Yet poverty made their pregnancies all the harsher, as malnutrition and heavy labour weakened their bodies. Women worked in fields, baked bread, and carried water even when swollen with child. Their resilience was immense, but it came at great cost, shortening their lives and deepening the risks of childbirth. Repeated pregnancies drained strength, leaving many women frail by their 30s. Records show that countless mothers died before middle age, worn down by the endless cycle. Each new pregnancy brought not only joy but dread, as families knew how often the pattern ended in funerals. The body, already scarred by prior births, struggled more with each attempt. Survival was a feat, not an expectation, for few could endure the burden without loss. The Church, in its teachings, framed fertility as a sacred duty. To bear many children was praised as a sign of blessing, while attempts to limit it were seen as sin. This sanctification of reproduction added to the pressure upon women who found little room for refusal. Their suffering was wrapped in the language of holiness, yet the cost was written in graves filled with mothers and infants. The spiritual duty deepened the physical danger, binding faith and flesh together. I have read letters of noble women who confessed their exhaustion to husbands or confessors. They wrote of fear before each labour, of the weight of knowing their bodies might not survive. Some spoke of envy toward women who had ceased to conceive, spared the terror of another childbirth. These voices, preserved across centuries, reveal the quiet despair hidden beneath outward duty. They show that repeated pregnancies were not born without awareness of the peril they carried. The loss of mothers also reshaped families. Infants left behind might not live long. Fathers remarried swiftly, and children grew up under stepmothers who carried their own burdens. The cycle of repetition created not only physical scars, but social ones, as families fractured and rebuilt under constant strain. Inheritance, property, and kinship all turned upon the fragile thread of a woman's survival. Repeated pregnancies were not only personal trials, but forces shaping the very structure of medieval society. When I reflect on those centuries, I see women as the silent pillars of continuity, bearing the weight of life itself. Their bodies carried kingdoms, villages, and generations, often at the expense of their own years. The burden of repeated pregnancies was not a matter of choice, but of expectation, imposed by faith, family, and survival. To honor their endurance is to recognize that half of medieval history was written not in battles or treaties, but in the quiet and perilous cycles of birth. In an age where the Church condemned any attempt to hinder conception, knowledge of prevention passed quietly among women, spoken in whispers and hidden from clerical ears. Herbs such as pennyroyal, rue, and savin were used in secret, believed to either prevent or end pregnancy. Their potency was uncertain, their safety even less so, but they represented a small measure of control in lives otherwise dictated by expectation. To seek them was to risk both health and soul, yet desperation often overpowered fear. Midwives were sometimes the keepers of such knowledge, though they bore great danger in offering it. Accusations of sin or witchcraft hovered near, for to interfere with God's will in childbirth was considered grave. Still, many women turned to them in times of despair, when famine made another mouth unbearable, or when the burden of repeated pregnancies threatened to claim a life. The midwife's role was thus entangled not only with survival, but with secrecy, her remedies shared only with trust. Some methods were ritual as much as practical. Amulets were worn to ward off conception, and prayers to obscure saints were murmured in hope of divine exception. At times, these practices offered nothing but a fragile sense of agency, a belief that one might influence fate. Yet in a world where choice was so limited, even the illusion of power mattered. These rituals reveal the yearning of women to reclaim at least part of their destiny. The Church denounced all such efforts as mortal sin, teaching that every conception was divinely ordained. To interfere was to reject God's gift, and to end a pregnancy was seen as an offense worthy of excommunication. This strict stance ensured that fear accompanied every attempt at prevention. Women carried not only the danger of the herbs themselves, but also the weight of eternal judgment. It was a heavy silence, seldom written of, yet deeply felt across Christendom. The risks of the substances themselves were grave. Many of the plants used in secrecy were toxic, capable of causing organ failure or death. Women who sought relief from the endless cycle of birth sometimes instead found an untimely grave. Without knowledge of dosage or safe practice, remedies became poisons, turning attempts at survival into tragedies. The very act meant to preserve a woman's strength could claim her life before her child was even conceived. Yet evidence of such practices survives, recorded in medical texts and condemned in sermons. The writings of Trotula of Salerno, though cautious, mention methods to regulate fertility. Confessions preserved by inquisitors also reveal how widespread such knowledge was, though always hidden. These traces remind us that even in a world ruled by doctrine, the human desire for control over one's body endured. Silence could not erase the need, nor could fear fully extinguish the search for relief. In noble households, the matter carried additional weight, for the continuation of dynasties depended upon heirs. To prevent conception was seen not only as sin, but as treason against family and lineage. Women of rank had even less freedom than peasants in this regard, their wombs tied to politics and inheritance. Yet even queens may have sought escape in quiet remedies, though history rarely records their private struggles. The silence of the chronicles hides as much as it reveals. Reflecting upon these hidden practices, I see them as acts of courage and desperation, carried out in the shadows of faith and fear. They speak to the resilience of women who sought to wrest a measure of control from a world that left them little choice. Though dangerous and condemned, contraception and abortion in the Middle Ages remind us that the struggle for autonomy is not new. It has always been present, carried in whispers, in herbs, and in the unspoken prayers of the desperate. The first cry of a newborn was never taken for granted in the Middle Ages, for many did not live long beyond it. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with sickness, malnutrition, and frailty claiming lives within days or weeks. Families celebrated births with joy, yet their joy was tempered by fear, for they had seen too many small graves filled in the churchyard. To bring forth life was a blessing, but the survival of that life remained uncertain from the start. This uncertainty gave baptism a profound urgency. The Church taught that an unbaptized child's soul could not enter heaven, instead condemned to limbo, a fate unbearable for grieving parents. Thus, baptism was performed as swiftly as possible, often within hours of birth. Priests were summoned hastily, sometimes in the dead of night, to pour holy water upon the infant's head. Salvation of the soul became as urgent as the survival of the body. Midwives, aware of the danger, were granted the extraordinary right to baptize in emergencies. If a child seemed near death, the midwife herself might sprinkle water and recite the sacred words. This act, though unconventional, was accepted by the Church, for saving a soul outweighed matters of ritual. Such moments carried immense gravity, with midwives acting not only as healers of bodies, but as guardians of eternal destiny. Their role extended beyond life into the realm of salvation. In noble courts, the anxiety surrounding baptism was no less intense. The future of dynasties rested on heirs, yet even the most awaited child could be lost within days. Chronicles tell of elaborate baptisms planned for princes and princesses, only for death to arrive before the ceremony. In such cases, panic ensued to ensure at least an emergency blessing had been performed. The intersection of politics, faith, and mortality revealed itself most starkly in these fragile moments. Among the poor, baptism was often immediate and simple, carried out with whatever water was at hand. The urgency left no time for ceremony or grandeur. A small gathering of neighbors or kin might witness it, their voices trembling as prayers were spoken. These humble baptisms, performed in haste, carried the same weight as the grandest cathedral rites. For both rich and poor, the hope was the same, that the child's soul be secured before the body failed. The grief of losing an infant was heavy, yet faith provided a framework to endure it. Parents mourned, but they were told to find solace in the belief that baptized children entered heaven. This belief softened the pain, though it did not erase it. Letters and chronicles speak of mothers who never forgot the faces of the little ones they lost, even as they bore more children. Each life, however brief, was remembered with a mixture of sorrow and hope. Graveyards themselves bear witness to the scale of loss. Archaeologists uncover countless small coffins, sometimes placed beside mothers who died in childbirth. The earth holds these stories silently, reminders of how fragile life once was. Each burial was both a farewell and a prayer, committing the child to God's mercy. Communities grew accustomed to such sights, yet each family felt the wound anew, for grief never becomes ordinary, no matter how often it returns. In reflecting on those times, I cannot separate the cries of newborns from the tolling of bells that often followed. The fear of death and the hope of baptism intertwined, shaping the earliest days of every life. Infant mortality left deep marks upon families and faith alike, binding sorrow into the very fabric of society. It is through this lens that we glimpse the harshness of the medieval world, where even the first breath carried the weight of eternity. To carry life within was not only a physical burden, but a weight upon the mind. Women in the Middle Ages lived with the constant reminder of the dangers that awaited them in childbirth. Each pregnancy was accompanied not only by hope, but by dread, for they had seen sisters, mothers, and neighbors buried too soon. The joy of quickening was shadowed by the knowledge that survival was never assured. Such awareness carved deep lines of fear long before labor began. Letters from noble women reveal confessions of anxiety, words written in trembling hands to husbands or confessors. They spoke of sleepless nights, of prayers whispered in solitude, of wondering if they would live to see their children grow. The silence of peasant women left fewer records, yet their fear was no less real. Their voices echo instead through parish registers and the rows of graves in village churchyards. The absence of their words is itself a testament to the toll they bore. Generations carried this fear forward, for children grew up witnessing the losses of their households. A young girl who watched her mother die in childbirth would later face her own with memories carved into her heart. In this way, fear was not born fresh but inherited, shaping entire communities. The shadow of mortality was passed along like an heirloom, binding women together in silent kinship. It was a shared dread, unspoken yet deeply understood. Faith offered comfort, but it also reinforced the inevitability of suffering. Women were taught that labor pain was punishment for Eve's sin, a duty laid upon them by divine decree. To question this was to question God himself, leaving few outlets for expressing despair. Acceptance was preached as virtue, yet acceptance did not erase the fear that gnawed at every mother-to-be. The toll of expectancy lay not in denial, but in the endurance of waiting for what might come. Among the noble, the burden was heightened by the eyes of the realm. Queens and princesses knew that their survival affected not only their households, but the fate of kingdoms. Every pregnancy was a matter of state, and every labor carried political consequences. The pressure to produce heirs compounded the private fear of death, leaving women caught between personal peril and public duty. Their minds bore more than one weight, yet both were heavy with consequence. In the villages, the strain was woven into daily labor. Women worked the fields, fetched water, and tended fires while carrying the constant awareness of looming danger. Their resilience was remarkable, yet resilience does not erase fear. It lingers beneath the surface, shaping the way they sang lullabies, prepared meals, and prayed at night. Every action carried the quiet knowledge that life was fragile, and that their own might be demanded in the bringing forth of another. The psychological toll extended also to families. Husbands waited outside chambers with trembling hands, uncertain if they would hear the cries of a child or the silence of death. Children prayed for their mothers, fearing the absence they had seen in others' homes. Expectancy was not a private burden alone, but a collective strain, shared by all who loved the woman in peril. The fear rippled outward, binding entire households in quiet apprehension. When I ponder these memories, I see expectancy not as joy alone, but as a long season of tension. The mind of a pregnant woman in those centuries was a battlefield of hope and dread, courage and resignation. This toll, invisible yet immense, shaped the very rhythm of medieval life. It reminds us that survival was not measured only in bodies, but in spirits, tested again and again by the weight of waiting for fate's decree. The experience of childbirth varied greatly between the stone halls of castles and the humble cottages of peasants, though danger bound them both. Noble women often had attendants, midwives of reputation, and access to herbs and relics thought to bring safety. Their chambers were warmed by fires, their beds covered in fine linens. Yet no matter the luxury, death still lingered at the bedside. Titles and wealth could not soften the risk that each contraction might be the last. Queens and noble ladies faced a unique weight. The survival of dynasties rested upon their bodies. Every child they bore was a potential heir, a safeguard for inheritance, or a pawn in alliances. Chroniclers record Eleanor of Castile and Blanche of Lancaster, women of high station who endured repeated pregnancies, many ending in loss. Their deaths in childbed altered the fate of kingdoms, proving that no crown could protect against the perils of labor. Nobility was no shield from sorrow. In contrast, peasant women bore children in cottages, with little aid beyond kin and local midwives. They labored in smoky, cramped rooms, sometimes with animals under the same roof. Malnutrition and the toll of physical work deepened their peril. A woman might harvest grain one day and give birth the next, her body already weakened by toil. Their resilience was extraordinary, yet survival was never certain, and loss was often endured in silence, unrecorded by history. The disparity lay not in safety, but in the visibility of suffering. When a queen died, the news spread across kingdoms, noted in chronicles and sermons. When a peasant woman perished, only her family and village mourned, her story unmarked in ink. Yet her absence carried as much weight within her home as the death of a queen did in court. Both noble and common lives were shaped by the same dangers, though remembered differently by the world. Among nobles, wet nurses often took over once the child was born, allowing the mother to recover more swiftly or prepare for another pregnancy. Peasant mothers, by contrast, nursed their children themselves while resuming fieldwork and household duties. The burden upon their bodies was heavier, for rest was a luxury they could not afford. These differences show how wealth could shape recovery, though it never guaranteed survival in the moments that mattered most. The expectations also differed. Noble women were praised for producing heirs, their worth tied to dynastic success. Their fertility was political currency, binding families and realms together. Peasant women, however, were valued for their contribution to labor as well as childbirth, expected to sustain both field and home. In both cases, their identities were defined by roles of service, one to family honor, the other to subsistence. Their lives reveal how womanhood was measured by sacrifice. Archaeological evidence confirms these contrasts. Noble graves sometimes show women buried with tokens of status, while village cemeteries reveal lives cut short in greater numbers. The bones of peasant women often bear marks of hard labor, bent spines and worn joints, while noble remains suggest lives shaped by confinement and repeated pregnancies. Yet both tell the same truth. Childbirth claimed women across all stations, with no regard for silk or homespun cloth. When I think on these differences, I see less division than shared fate. Whether in castles or cottages, women walked the same perilous path, their cries echoing through chambers rich and poor alike. The noblewoman's loss shook thrones, the peasant's loss shook families, yet both were wounds upon the heart of their time. The chasm between ranks could not erase the unity of suffering, for in childbirth all women stood equal before death's shadow. The hand of the church reached into the most intimate corners of medieval life, and childbirth was no exception. Priests and theologians spoke with authority about how women should conduct themselves during pregnancy, framing their guidance as protection for both body and soul. Abstinence from marital relations was urged, fasting recommended, and confessions encouraged to prepare the mother spiritually. These directives, though cloaked in piety, often weakened women further, stripping them of the strength they so desperately needed for survival. In sermons, childbirth was frequently presented as a test of obedience. Pain was not merely natural, but divinely appointed, a living reminder of Eve's transgression. To resist or to complain was frowned upon, as if such cries challenged God's decree. Women were told to endure with humility, for through suffering they might be sanctified. The weight of this belief pressed heavily upon expectant mothers, deepening their fear even as it sought to guide them. The church also shaped the physical space of birth through blessings and relics. Candles blessed at Candlemas, relics of saints, and holy water were brought into the birthing room. Priests visited to pronounce prayers or to leave written charms inscribed with verses of scripture. In this way, childbirth became not only a bodily struggle, but a spiritual battlefield. Every contraction was framed as part of a greater contest between faith and death. Clerical writings reveal how deeply these ideas were rooted. Theologians such as Thomas Aquinas debated questions of ensoulment, influencing attitudes toward both pregnancy and miscarriage. Their conclusions reinforced the sacredness of every conception, leaving little space for women to assert control. Even miscarriage was interpreted through a spiritual lens, its meaning bound to divine will rather than to nature or health. Such teachings strengthened the Church's authority while leaving women with few choices of their own. Confessors played a role as well, urging women to purify their souls before labor. Some were instructed to take the Eucharist in preparation, as if girding themselves for battle. The presence of priests could be both comforting and alarming. Comfort in the assurance of God's care, alarming in the reminder that death might be near. These spiritual practices became part of the rhythm of birth, reinforcing the belief that survival was as much a matter of grace as of strength. Among the poor, the Church's influence was felt most strongly through ritual. Baptisms were hurried, confessions made, and prayers recited. The guidance of priests often replaced access to medical help, shaping not only beliefs but daily practices. For the wealthy, these teachings mingled with political necessity, as queens and noblewomen were pressured to endure repeated pregnancies under the banner of divine duty. Across all ranks, the Church's words carved themselves into the lives of women. Some resisted quietly, clinging to folk remedies, or whispered traditions outside clerical approval. Yet even these practices were often dressed in Christian forms, so that old charms bore the names of saints instead of pagan gods. The blending of Church teaching with older customs shows both the power of its influence and the determination of women to hold on to any hope. Faith was not only imposed, but adapted, shaped by the resilience of those who bore its burden. When I reflect upon these practices, I see both comfort and constraint. The Church gave meaning to suffering, but it also bound women to expectations that increased their peril. Its teachings wove childbirth into the fabric of sin and salvation, elevating it beyond the realm of the body. The influence of the Church reached far beyond prayer. It molded the very way women prepared, endured, and remembered the act of giving life in the medieval world. Though many stories of childbirth were carried only in memory, the earth itself has preserved their truth. Archaeologists uncover cemeteries where the bones of young women outnumber those of older ages, showing how perilous the childbearing years truly were. In graveyards across Europe, women in their 20s and 30s are disproportionately represented, their deaths aligning with the years of highest fertility. These silent witnesses reveal what written records only hinted at: that childbirth was among the most common causes of female mortality. The figures, drawn from parish registers and later chronicles, estimate that 1 to 2 women per 100 died in each labour. At first glance, the number may seem small, but repeated over a dozen or more pregnancies, the odds became crushing. A woman could expect to gamble her life again and again, the danger compounding with every child she bore. These statistics are not mere numbers, but the echo of countless families broken by loss. Excavations bring this reality to light in poignant ways. Archaeologists find graves where mother and infant lie together, their deaths bound by the same ordeal. In some cases, the remains of a newborn are still within the mother's pelvis, a haunting testament to obstructed labor. These burials confirm what chronicles recorded, that childbirth often claimed 2 lives at once. Such evidence does not speak in words, yet it carries a weight heavier than any chronicle's ink. Noble records preserve names more clearly, listing queens and duchesses who perished in childbed. Eleanor of Castile, Jeanne of Navarre, and other high-born women stand as examples noted by chroniclers. Their deaths altered dynasties, shifting alliances and shaping history. Yet for every queen remembered in manuscripts, countless peasant women died without record, their stories preserved only in the soil. Archaeology gives them voice at last, lifting them from anonymity into remembrance. Even skeletal remains tell stories of hardship endured before death. Signs of rickets, malnutrition, and pelvic deformities are found in women's bones, conditions that made childbirth far more dangerous. These physical traces reveal how poverty and diet shaped survival, linking social conditions to mortality. In the lines of bone and the wear of joints, one can read the tale of daily struggle, carried silently through the centuries until unearthed by careful hands. Demographers studying these remains piece together the scale of loss. They show that maternal mortality, when considered across a lifetime of pregnancies, could claim as many as 1 in 3 women. This truth reshapes how we view medieval society, for it means that nearly every family experienced such loss. Death in childbirth was not a rare misfortune, but an ever-present reality, woven into the structure of community and kinship. The toll of these deaths extended beyond numbers. Each loss reshaped households, altered inheritance, and left children motherless. Communities learned to expect such fractures, yet the grief remained sharp with every occurrence. Statistics and bones reveal the scale, but the sorrow was felt in empty cradles, in husbands who remarried too soon, in the names of mothers missing from later records. The human cost was vast, shaping both memory and survival. When I ponder these findings, I see not only the fragility of life, but the endurance of remembrance. Numbers, graves, and bones remind us that history is not merely battles and kings, but the lives of women who bore the greatest risks in silence. Their mortality is carved into the landscape of Europe, into the very foundations of its villages and cities. To honor their memory is to understand the depth of the shadow that childbirth cast upon an entire age. When death came to a mother in childbirth, it did not stop with her. Families were torn apart, households left unsteady, and men found themselves widowed in an instant. A father holding a newborn often did so with trembling hands, unsure how he would keep the child alive without the mother's care. The grief was doubled, mourning the woman lost while struggling to preserve the fragile life just begun. Such moments reveal how deeply maternal mortality reshaped the very fabric of family life. Widowers often remarried quickly, not out of forgetfulness, but out of necessity. Infants needed feeding, children required guidance, and households could not function without a woman's presence. Records show men remarrying within months of a wife's death, their choices driven more by survival than by love. New unions sometimes eased the burden, yet they also brought complexities, with stepmothers raising children not their own. These arrangements, born of necessity, reveal how death in childbirth rippled far beyond the moment itself. For the infants left behind, survival was precarious. Without their mother's milk, many did not live long, especially among the poor who lacked wet nurses. Hunger and neglect claimed lives swiftly, making the loss of the mother almost a death sentence for the child. Among nobles, wet nurses provided some hope, though even there, infant mortality remained high. The bond between mother and child was thus not only emotional, but often the very line between life and death. Communities bore witness to these fractures. Parish registers tell of infants baptized only to be buried weeks later, their mothers already in the grave beside them. Neighbors rallied to help, offering food or tending to children when fathers labored in fields. Yet such support could not replace the central figure of the mother. Her absence left wounds that no kindness could fully mend, reshaping both family and village life in lasting ways. Among nobles, the political consequences were immense. A widowed king or lord remarried swiftly, ensuring dynastic continuity. Yet the children of the first wife sometimes found themselves overshadowed by heirs from the second, their inheritance contested. The death of a noblewoman in childbed could thus alter the course of kingdoms, shifting alliances and unsettling succession. What began as private grief became public turmoil, a reminder of how fragile political stability truly was. Step-families became common, shaping the childhood of many. Some stepmothers embraced their roles with care, while others saw their duty only to their own children. Stories of discord abound in chronicles and letters, reflecting the tensions such arrangements created. The scars of maternal death were not only immediate but generational, felt in the bonds, or the fractures, between half-siblings. Medieval families, like their homes, were rebuilt again and again upon the ruins of loss. The Church, too, addressed this reality, urging widowers to provide care for their children and to accept new marriages as part of God's plan. Priests preached patience and duty, though their words offered little balm to fathers watching infants fade without mother's milk. The repetition of loss made such sermons familiar, as if grief had become a permanent presence in every parish. Faith sustained many, but it could not erase the harshness of daily survival. When I recall the sight of widowers, their faces hollow with sorrow and uncertainty, I see how childbirth's danger extended beyond the chamber. It was never the mother alone who perished. It was the stability of entire households, sometimes of entire lineages. Widowers and orphaned children stand as reminders that each maternal death echoed far beyond the grave, reshaping lives and futures. In their grief, one sees the wider shadow that childbirth cast across the medieval world. When word spread that a woman carried more than one child, fear rather than joy often filled the air. Twins and triplets were seen as marvels, yet they carried peril that few could survive. The body already strained by one infant was pushed beyond its limits, making labor longer, blood loss greater, and survival rarer. What should have been cause for celebration was shadowed by dread, for many knew the likelihood of both mother and children perishing was painfully high. Accounts from chronicles describe such labors with stark brevity. A midwife might record that both were lost, or that the mother expired after prolonged struggle. These words conceal the agony behind them, yet they reveal how common tragedy was in multiple births. Even when one child survived, the toll upon the mother's body was devastating. The sight of two cradles prepared but only one filled, or none at all, left a sorrow that lingered for generations. Among peasants, whose lives were already worn thin by labor and hunger, the challenge was even greater. Malnutrition weakened women, narrowing their chances of enduring a single birth, let alone two or more. Twins demanded more strength than most could summon, and the survival of both infants was rare. Families sometimes interpreted such births as signs from God, either blessing or curse, depending on whether life or death followed. The mystery of multiples deepened both faith and fear. Noble households also felt the weight of such ordeals. Chronicles mention duchesses and queens whose bodies were ravaged by the strain of bearing more than one heir at once. The anticipation of strengthening dynasties through multiple heirs often turned to despair when mothers and children alike succumbed. Even with wealth, attendants, and relics, their survival was not assured. Dynastic hopes could vanish in the same night they had been proclaimed. Superstition clung closely to the birth of twins. Some believed one child was destined for holiness, the other for ruin. Others saw in them omens of conflict, as if two lives born together must struggle against each other. These beliefs added weight to already fragile circumstances, shaping how communities regarded surviving twins. They were sometimes celebrated as wonders, sometimes feared as harbingers, their very existence interpreted through the lens of medieval imagination. The remedies attempted in such cases were desperate and uncertain. Midwives prayed to saints, placed charms in the birthing room, and tried shifting positions to ease the passage. Yet obstructed labor was almost inevitable, and when one child blocked the other, no skill could alter fate. In these moments, families turned their eyes heavenward, for earthly help was powerless. Survival, if it came, was seen as nothing short of miraculous. Archaeological evidence offers further proof of the rarity of success. Graves sometimes hold the remains of twins buried together, their small bones telling the story of lives too brief. In a few cases, mothers are found alongside them, silent testimony to the dangers of such births. These findings bring to light what records often omitted, the scale of loss endured quietly by countless families. The earth itself holds the memory of those who never drew more than a single breath. Reflecting on these tragedies, I see how multiple births magnified the fragility of medieval life. What today might be met with cautious hope was then greeted with trembling hearts, for danger loomed over every cry of labor, the survival of mother and children together was the rarest of outcomes. The dangers of twins and triplets remind us how narrow the path of life once was, where joy and grief were never far apart, and where miracles were measured in survival itself. The rooms where women laboured were far from clean, for knowledge of sanitation was absent in those centuries. Floors were of packed earth or rough boards, often damp with smoke and soot from the hearth. Linens were reused many times, seldom washed in boiling water, and hands went uncleaned before touching mother or child. The very environment in which life began was already filled with unseen threats. It was a silent enemy that no prayer nor relic could keep away. Midwives and attendants did what they could, but their understanding was limited. A cloth that had served one woman might be used for another, spreading infection without awareness. Knives or scissors to cut cords were rinsed at best, rarely sterilized by heat. Even the water used in washing could be contaminated, drawn from wells shared with animals. Every action, though meant to heal, risked worsening the danger. The lack of hygiene made childbirth as deadly as the battlefield. In cottages, the situation was harsher still. Chickens scratched in corners, pigs snorted outside, and smoke from the fire filled the air. A woman might give birth beside tools of daily labour or amidst the damp of winter. These were not places suited for the fragility of new life, yet they were all that families had. The closeness of dirt, animals, and disease meant infections thrived, striking women down days after they had survived the ordeal of delivery. Even in noble homes, cleanliness was relative. Rich fabrics, tapestries, and cushions adorned the chambers, but they too harboured dust, insects, and stale air. Servants moved in and out, carrying with them whatever illnesses lingered in the castle halls. Fires provided warmth but little ventilation, leaving the birthing room heavy with smoke and odour. Luxury gave comfort, but it did not bring true safety, for ignorance of hygiene crossed all boundaries of wealth. Religious beliefs sometimes shaped how cleanliness was understood. Washing before prayer was valued, yet cleansing for the sake of health was less emphasized. Midwives might wash their hands with herbs to invoke blessing rather than to remove dirt. The spiritual was mingled with the physical, but the unseen cause of infection remained hidden. Without knowledge of germs, water and ritual could not achieve what was most needed. Their efforts, though sincere, were powerless against the invisible. Accounts from monasteries tell of attempts to improve conditions, urging ventilation or the burning of herbs to cleanse the air. Yet these measures, while well-intended, addressed smell more than sanitation. The true dangers lay in bacteria unknown to them, passed in ways they could not imagine. Thus, even with care and ritual, many mothers succumbed to fevers after childbirth, their lives claimed by what lingered in the very tools meant to aid them. The persistence of such conditions reveals how daily life itself was steeped in risk. Food, water, and shelter all carried hazards, and childbirth merely brought them into sharper focus. Women who lived through one birth might die in the next, not from the strain of labour alone, but from the filth that surrounded it. Their survival depended as much upon chance as upon skill, for the tools of medicine lacked the foundation of cleanliness. When I reflect upon those rooms, I see how little separated life from death. A clean cloth or washed hand might have saved countless women, yet such knowledge lay centuries away. Hygiene and sanitation shortcomings were not failures of will, but of understanding, and their cost was immense. These forgotten details of daily life remind us how fragile existence once was, when ignorance of the smallest things carried the heaviest consequences. In the uncertainty of labour, women often placed their hopes in heavenly protectors, whose lives or legends seemed bound to their suffering. Chief among them was Saint Margaret of Antioch, believed to aid women in peril. Her story of escaping from the belly of a dragon mirrored the ordeal of birth, and her name was invoked in whispered prayers beside countless beds. Small images of her were kept close, tokens of courage against the shadow of death. Faith turned her legend into a lifeline. St. Anne, Mother of the Virgin Mary, also stood as a figure of solace. As the grandmother of Christ, she embodied maternal strength and compassion. Shrines dedicated to her became places of pilgrimage, where women prayed for safe delivery or gave thanks for survival. The Church encouraged such devotion, blending theology with the daily fears of its people. In the glow of candles before her image, women found strength to face their own trials of labor. Other saints were called upon depending on region and tradition. St. Bridget in Ireland, associated with fertility and healing, received countless petitions. St. Raymond Nonatus, though a man, was later venerated for being delivered by caesarean after his mother's death. Each saint carried a story that resonated with the trials of childbirth, shaping how women approached their danger. These figures served as intercessors, believed to stand between suffering mortals and the mercy of heaven. Pilgrimage was sometimes undertaken by expectant mothers or by their families on their behalf. Relics of saints were sought, touched, and carried home to be placed beneath pillows or tied to girdles. Such journeys reflected the desperation of families who would do anything to secure divine protection. Even those too poor to travel might send tokens or letters to shrines, trusting that distance did not lessen the power of prayer. Hope stretched across landscapes, bound to holy places. The cult of saints also created community bonds. Women shared stories of miraculous escapes, of friends or kin saved through invocation of a particular patron. These tales reinforced faith, weaving childbirth into a tapestry of divine intervention. They also gave language to survival, allowing women to see their endurance as a miracle rather than mere chance. Through these shared devotions, fear was given shape, and relief was credited to heavenly guardians. Yet devotion could also deepen anxiety. If a woman or child died despite prayers, some feared it was a sign of unworthiness or neglect of faith. Grief was compounded by guilt, as families questioned whether they had prayed enough or chosen the right patron. This tension reveals the complexity of faith in childbirth. It offered comfort, yet also burdened the heart with doubt when outcomes were grim. The saints were protectors, but their silence could wound. In noble households, patronage of saints became highly visible. Chapels were dedicated, masses paid for, and relics displayed in chambers where queens labored. Chroniclers note such details as proof of piety, showing that even the most powerful sought aid beyond earthly means. Yet the deaths of queens in childbed, despite such devotion, reminded all that sainthood did not guarantee survival. Still, the rituals endured, for hope is seldom silenced by failure. Looking back, I see how the saints of childbirth reveal both the fear and the faith of the Middle Ages. They were anchors in stormy waters, figures who gave women strength when no medicine could assure them. Whether their aid was real or imagined matters less than the comfort they brought. In their names, countless women faced the darkness of labor with courage, believing they were not alone. That belief itself was a form of salvation. When a queen went into labor, it was not a private ordeal, but a matter of state. The chambers of royalty filled with attendants, courtiers, and witnesses, for the birth of an heir was a political event. Chroniclers stood ready to record each detail, from the first cries to the outcome, whether joyous or tragic. The weight of dynasties pressed heavily upon the mother, who labored under more than physical pain. Her body was the vessel of succession, her survival a question for kingdoms. In these palaces, childbirth unfolded beneath scrutiny unknown to common women. Curtains and tapestries could not conceal the presence of dozens who gathered to ensure the legitimacy of the child. The queen's privacy was sacrificed for the sake of inheritance, her suffering made almost a spectacle. Though she lay in pain, her role was framed as duty to crown and country. The personal trial became a public drama, echoing far beyond the chamber's walls. The risk of death was ever present, even amidst luxury. Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, perished after giving birth to Edward, her brief triumph over danger claimed swiftly by fever. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, succumbed after bearing many children. her loss marking both a personal grief and a political tremor. The deaths of royal mothers were not whispered but proclaimed, their passing altering alliances, treaties, and the very course of nations. Dynasties could unravel with a single labour gone wrong. The death of a queen without leaving heirs threatened succession, sometimes plunging realms into crisis. Rival claimants rose, wars were waged, and blood was spilled because a mother's body failed in its perilous task. In this way, childbirth and politics were intertwined, the cradle and the throne bound inseparably together. The fate of nations often rested upon the survival of one woman in childbed. Courts surrounded queens with relics, priests and physicians, yet none of these could guarantee safety. Holy objects were placed at bedsides, prayers chanted, and midwives chosen with care. Physicians offered their counsel, though often powerless when complications arose. Despite all this attention, the danger remained as grim as in the poorest cottage. Wealth and power brought no immunity, only more eyes to witness the same shadows of mortality. When queens survived, celebrations resounded across kingdoms. Bells rang, feasts were held, and proclamations announced the birth of heirs. Yet joy was tempered by memory, for every court remembered the queens who had not survived. The shadow of loss lingered in the halls, never far from the splendor of celebration. Those who witnessed such events carried them in silence, knowing how swiftly joy could collapse into mourning. The image of a widowed king, cradling a fragile heir while grieving his wife, is one that recurs through the chronicles. These moments revealed the vulnerability of rulers, who despite crowns and armies could not command life itself. Royal widowers often remarried quickly, their grief bound up with political necessity. The cycle of loss and renewal echoed through palaces as it did through villages, though its consequences for kingdoms were far greater. In my reflection, I see that death in the royal court was not merely a family tragedy, but a turning point for entire nations. Childbirth was the thread upon which dynasties hung, and when it snapped, kingdoms trembled. The struggles of queens remind us that history is not only shaped by kings in battle, but by women whose perilous labours determined the line of succession. Their silent suffering left marks as deep upon history as any crown of gold. Though childbirth was marked by fear, it was also surrounded by circles of women who offered their strength and presence. Mothers, sisters, and neighbours gathered around the labouring woman, bringing not only herbs and cloths, but companionship. Their voices whispered prayers, their hands steadied trembling limbs. Their presence gave courage in the face of dread. Birth was thus not endured in solitude, but within a network of shared endurance. This gathering of women became a sanctuary against isolation. The midwife was at the centre, but she was rarely alone. Experienced women of the village assisted her, each lending knowledge gleaned from earlier labours. Their tasks ranged from heating water to holding candles, from preparing swaddling cloths to comforting the mother with song. These helpers were not trained in formal schools, yet their familiarity with the process brought reassurance. They embodied the communal wisdom of generations, woven together in each birthing room. In times of difficulty, these networks carried more than practical support. They bore witness to loss, shared grief, and ensured that no family mourned alone. When death came, women prepared the body, washed it, and laid it out for burial. They stayed with the family, comforting children, cooking meals, and sitting in silence when words could not ease sorrow. In this way, community softened the edges of tragedy, even when survival could not be secured. The presence of these networks also gave women a rare form of authority. In most aspects of medieval life, men held power, yet the birthing room was ruled by women. They set the rituals, made the decisions, and carried the knowledge. It was a domain of female agency, where midwives and attendants were respected, if only for a moment. Within that space, women found a measure of influence denied to them in the broader world. These gatherings were not only about survival, but also about connection. Young girls sometimes observed, learning what their futures might hold. Elderly women shared stories of their own labors, weaving memory into guidance. Bonds deepened across generations, as childbirth became both a shared ordeal and a link between past and present. The birthing room, though filled with fear, was also a place where community strengthened its ties. Religious rituals often accompanied these gatherings. Psalms were sung, relics passed hand to hand, candles lit before icons. The women prayed together, binding their fear into collective supplication. Faith was not only personal but communal, giving the sense that heaven itself was called into the chamber. In the blending of ritual and presence, women found resilience. The act of gathering transformed fear into solidarity, a shared strength stronger than solitude. Among nobles, these networks took a more formal shape. Ladies in waiting and trusted attendants filled the queen's chamber, each tasked with a role. Yet the essence was the same: women surrounding women, offering presence in peril. Though chroniclers recorded names and titles, the spirit of their support was no different from that of villagers gathering in a humble cottage. Across rank and station, this female companionship was a constant in the face of childbirth's dangers. When I recall these scenes, I do not think first of herbs or relics, but of the hands clasped, the voices steadying fear, the eyes meeting in silent understanding. Community support did not erase the risks, but it gave women the strength to face them. These networks of care and kinship reveal the resilience of medieval society, where survival was rarely an individual struggle, but a collective one. In that shared endurance lay both sorrow and solace. The written word preserved what little knowledge existed, though it was often a patchwork of wisdom, superstition, and inherited tradition. Among the most notable was the Trotula, a collection from Salerno attributed to a woman healer, offering guidance on women's health. These texts spoke of hygiene, diet, and remedies for easing labor, yet they mingled practical advice with theories of humors and astrology. They stand as mirrors of their time, half rooted in observation, half in belief. In their pages lies both progress and limitation. Monastic scribes copied such works with diligence, ensuring their survival across generations. In the quiet of scriptoria, monks bent over parchment, recording recipes for poultices, instructions for baths, and prayers to be recited during labor. Their efforts gave permanence to practices that might otherwise have been lost. Yet the absence of direct experience in these writings is clear, for many who penned them had never set foot in a birthing chamber. Their knowledge was theoretical, removed from the cries of women. Illustrations sometimes accompanied these manuscripts, showing diagrams of wombs, fetuses, or tools of delivery. To modernize, they appear crude, but they reveal an earnest attempt to understand the mysteries of birth. The drawings reflected more imagination than anatomy, for dissection of women was rare. Still, these images gave midwives and physicians a reference point, however imperfect. They remind us how difficult it was to learn of what could scarcely be seen. The texts were not uniform across Europe. In Italy, the Salernitan school produced works blending classical Greek thought with Arabic medicine. In France and England, manuscripts often leaned more heavily on religious ritual and moral instruction. This variety reveals the diversity of medieval knowledge, shaped by region, culture, and faith. What was considered sound practice in one land might be dismissed as folly in another, leaving childbirth care fragmented and inconsistent. For noble families, access to such manuscripts was a privilege. Queens and duchesses could summon physicians trained in university teachings, their advice drawn from these books. Peasant women, by contrast, relied upon oral tradition, for manuscripts were costly and rare. The gulf between written medicine and lived practice was wide, though both were constrained by the same ignorance of infection and anatomy. Knowledge, whether read or remembered, still faltered before the risks of birth. Within these writings, glimpses of progress do appear. Some advised cleanliness, recommended rest for the mother, or noted the dangers of excessive bloodletting. A few even spoke of nutrition, urging expectant women to eat well and avoid harsh exertion. These fragments of truth show that observation sometimes cut through theory, though rarely enough to save lives. The manuscripts held seeds of understanding, but they lacked the soil of experimentation in which to grow. The Church's influence can also be felt in their pages. Many texts mingled medical advice with prayers, suggesting remedies alongside invocations of saints. The boundaries between healing and devotion blurred, reflecting the worldview of the age. For medieval readers, this fusion made sense, for the body and soul were seen as inseparable. A treatment incomplete without prayer was as natural to them as it seems foreign to us. When I reflect on these manuscripts, I see them as fragile bridges across centuries. They capture both the earnest striving for knowledge and the weight of misunderstanding that bound their age. Though limited, they were stepping stones toward greater understanding, the roots from which modern medicine would later grow. In their ink-stained pages, the struggle of medieval society to comprehend the peril of childbirth is preserved, a testimony both to its courage and its blindness. The stars above were not merely admired for their beauty, but consulted for guidance in the most intimate matters of life. Many believed that the alignment of planets at the time of conception or birth determined the child's fate and the mother's safety. Astrologers drew up charts, tracing Mars, Venus, and the Moon, seeking to predict whether labor would be swift or perilous. These calculations gave families a sense of order, as if the heavens themselves held answers to the uncertainty of childbirth. In courts and noble households, astrology carried particular weight. Kings and queens employed astrologers to forecast auspicious times for conception or delivery. A birth under the right constellation was believed to bless dynasties, while an ill-starred labor brought fear of both death and misfortune. The writings of medieval astrologers survive, filled with predictions that mingled with politics. A queen's belly thus became not only a matter of health, but a canvas upon which the heavens were read. Midwives and villagers, though less versed in scholarly astrology, still held deep respect for lunar cycles. The phases of the moon were thought to influence the tides of the womb, quickening or delaying labor. Farmers and peasants who planted by the moon also believed it guided the timing of birth. Women in labor often heard such sayings, their pain interpreted through celestial patterns. These beliefs tied earthly bodies to the rhythms of the sky. The medical world, too, was steeped in astrological thinking. University-trained physicians relied on horoscopes as much as on humoral theory. Charts were drawn before attempting treatments, and certain days were considered inauspicious for intervention. Even the cutting of cords or administration of herbs might be delayed until the stars aligned favorably. In this way, science and superstition intertwined, shaping how medieval society confronted the dangers of childbirth. Not all viewed astrology with favor. Some theologians condemned its influence, warning that to trust the stars was to deny God's providence. Yet others within the Church tolerated it, seeing celestial order as part of divine design. This tension allowed astrology to flourish, even within a religious society wary of pagan echoes. Families desperate for reassurance often embraced it regardless of doctrine, for when life and death hung in the balance, no comfort was too small. The accuracy of such predictions was, of course, uncertain. A child born under Jupiter's blessing might still die in infancy, and a labor marked by ill omens might end without harm. Yet the act of consulting the stars offered families a sense of preparation. In an unpredictable world, astrology provided a framework, however fragile, that made suffering feel less random. It gave meaning to the chaos, transforming fear into a narrative written in the heavens. Astrological manuscripts spread across Europe, filled with diagrams of constellations and elaborate instructions. These texts reveal how seriously such practices were regarded, copied with the same care as religious works. Some combined astrological charts with medical recipes, blending two systems into one. They reflect a society unwilling to separate the physical from the cosmic, seeking truth in both the body and the stars. When I think of those nights, I imagine mothers gazing upward between pains, their eyes searching for comfort in the constellations. Whether accurate or not, astrology gave them a sense of connection to something greater than their own suffering. The role of the stars in childbirth reminds us how medieval people sought to weave meaning into life's harshest trials. In their hope, one sees the timeless human need to believe that destiny lies not only in chance, but also in the order of the cosmos. When a woman perished in childbirth, the customs of death quickly followed, blending sorrow with ritual. Families gathered to wash her body, laying her out with care and reverence. If the infant too had died, the two were often buried together, their bond in life preserved in death. Such burials have been uncovered in graves across Europe, silent testimony to grief carried for centuries. The mother's passing was marked not only as personal loss, but as a rupture in the very fabric of community. Priests played a central role in these moments, ensuring that the sacraments were observed. If the child had been baptized, the burial followed the rites of the church, prayers offered for the tiny soul. But if baptism had not been performed, anguish deepened, for many feared the infant's exclusion from heaven. This fear shaped the urgency of baptisms during labor, and in death, it shaped the sorrow of families left behind. Rituals were the only balm for such wounds. In villages, the funeral processions were small, yet heartfelt. Women of the community often took the lead, carrying the body, singing laments, and comforting the bereaved. These customs emphasized solidarity, reminding families they did not grieve alone. The churchyard filled with such graves, many unmarked, yet each representing a story cut short. These resting places became woven into the memory of the community, each stone or mound a reminder of childbirth's peril. Noble courts, by contrast, transformed such losses into public events. The death of a queen or princess was accompanied by elaborate ceremonies, her body clothed in rich garments, surrounded by candles and relics. Chroniclers recorded every detail, for dynastic stability demanded that grief be shown with grandeur. Infants of royal blood, baptized or not, were laid to rest with solemn rites. Yet even amidst gold and incense, sorrow echoed the same as in humble cottages. Burials sometimes placed mother and child in a single coffin, symbolizing their unity. Archaeologists have found such interments, the infant nestled beside the mother's ribcage or still within her pelvis. These discoveries reveal the intimacy of grief, how families sought to honor both together rather than separate them. It was as if death itself could not sever the tie forged in childbirth, a final gesture of tenderness in the face of tragedy. Laments and mourning songs accompanied these rituals, passed orally through generations. Women sang of loss, weaving personal sorrow into communal expression. These songs, though seldom written down, gave voice to the unspoken pain of lives lost too soon. In their rhythms, grief found release, binding memory into melody. Even centuries later, echoes of these laments linger in folk traditions, traces of mourning born in birthing chambers. Children left motherless were often brought to the graveside, held by grieving fathers or relatives. The presence of the living among the dead underscored the fragile line between survival and loss. For these infants, the rituals were both farewell and initiation, marking their entry into life through the absence of the one who bore them. Communities rallied to support them, yet the memory of such funerals often followed them throughout their lives. Reflecting on these customs, I see how death in childbirth was not hidden, but acknowledged openly. Rituals gave structure to grief, allowing families to honor sacrifice and endure sorrow. Whether in village or court, the burial of mother and child carried profound meaning, shaping how societies understood both mortality and motherhood. These rites stand as reminders that even amidst suffering, medieval people sought dignity, connection, and hope in the shadow of loss. The peril and hope of childbirth found their way into the imagery carved into stone and painted onto vellum. In churches, sculptures sometimes depicted women in labor, framed within religious scenes that reminded viewers of both Eve's curse and Mary's purity. Manuscript illuminations showed mothers in bed, surrounded by attendants, midwives bending over with herbs and cloths. These depictions were not idle decoration. They were reflections of the reality all knew, anchoring art in the shared fears of society. Literary works, too, carried references to childbirth, often as warnings of mortality. Medieval poets wrote of wives lost in childbed, weaving sorrow into tales of family and faith. Chronicles recorded the deaths of queens with solemn care, their passing treated as pivotal events in history. In miracle stories, saints were shown intervening to save mothers or infants, their power demonstrated in moments of greatest vulnerability. Through words and images, childbirth became both symbol and subject, shaping the medieval imagination. The Virgin Mary stood as the most potent figure in this realm. Her immaculate conception and painless delivery were exalted as divine exception, contrasting with the suffering of ordinary women. Artists painted her serene, radiant, untouched by the agony faced by others. This image offered hope, but also reinforced the belief that pain was punishment, making Mary's example unreachable. The gulf between her purity and the reality of mothers deepened both faith and despair. Marginal illustrations in manuscripts sometimes showed humor or satire around birth, yet beneath the jest lay recognition of its risks. Caricatures of midwives, images of swollen bellies, or even grotesque depictions of difficult labor reveal how pervasive the subject was. Art served as both mirror and release, acknowledging danger through sacred reverence or through dark laughter. In both forms, it revealed how deeply childbirth shaped collective thought. In noble households, childbirth was also commemorated in commissioned works. Tapestries celebrated successful deliveries, while chronicles immortalized the birth of heirs. These works framed childbirth as triumph, linking the survival of mother and child to the destiny of dynasties. Yet even within such celebratory art, the shadow of mortality remained. The very act of recording a safe birth revealed how unusual and precious survival was. Folk songs and oral traditions preserved another side of the story. Women sang of mothers lost, of infants gone too soon, of prayers whispered in labor's hour. These verses, passed from one generation to another, kept alive the memory of suffering and endurance. While elite art celebrated heirs and saints, folk traditions carried the voices of ordinary women. Their poetry was raw, filled with sorrow, but also with resilience, echoing the unrecorded struggles of countless lives. Medieval plays, too, included scenes of childbirth, often mixing religious instruction with lived experience. Mystery plays depicted women in labor seeking the aid of saints, dramatizing the power of intercession. Audiences saw reflected on stage what they knew at home: the cries, the prayers, the uncertainty. Through theatre, the reality of birth was not hidden, but made part of public teaching, blending devotion with recognition of daily peril. Looking at these varied forms, I see how childbirth permeated the culture, not confined to homes and chambers, but etched into stone, parchment, and song. Art and literature gave shape to what words alone could not hold: the dread, the hope, the endurance of women. They remind us that medieval society, though often silent in chronicles of war and kings, never forgot the struggle of mothers. In their images and verses, the shadow and sanctity of childbirth remain preserved. When mothers did not survive, or when their strength was too diminished to nurse, another woman often stepped forward to feed the newborn. The wet nurse became a figure of necessity, her body sustaining life when the natural bond was broken. This practice, long established in Europe, bridged survival and social expectation. Infants who might otherwise have perished found nourishment in the care of another. The presence of wet nurses reveals both fragility and resilience within medieval society. Among noble families, the reliance on wet nurses was particularly strong. Queens and ladies expected to conceive again quickly, often handed infants to wet nurses so their fertility would not be delayed by breastfeeding. Contracts survive detailing their duties, payments, and the expectations of loyalty. These women sometimes lived within noble households, their own children left behind in villages. The politics of inheritance and dynasty thus shaped even the feeding of infants, tying the survival of heirs to the milk of strangers. For peasants, the arrangement was less formal, but no less vital. A neighbor or relative might nurse a child whose mother had died, sharing her own milk between her baby and another. This act was born of compassion and necessity, though it carried risk, for the nurse's health and diet directly affected the infant's survival. In communities bound by scarcity, such sharing of nourishment showed how lives were interwoven, each woman's body a resource for the survival of many. The Church viewed the practice with ambivalence. On one hand, it ensured survival of infants, especially heirs whose baptism and upbringing were crucial. On the other, it raised concerns about moral and spiritual influence, for medieval belief held that a child absorbed not only nourishment, but also the character of the woman who nursed it. Sermons warned noble families to choose carefully, lest the virtues or vices of the wet nurse be passed into the child with her milk. Literature of the age reflects these anxieties. Chronicles sometimes praised noble wet nurses for their loyalty, while others hinted at scandal or betrayal. Tales of children shaped by the nature of their nurse reveal how deeply the practice stirred unease. It was not merely a physical act, but a symbolic one, linking two lives in ways both intimate and contested. The wet nurse stood as both savior and suspect, essential yet never fully trusted. Archaeological and written evidence also reveals the impact upon the nurses themselves. Many were poor women who entered service to sustain their families, yet this meant parting from their own infants. Some lost their children while nourishing those of others, their sacrifice hidden in silence. Their role exposes the inequalities of medieval society, where the survival of noble heirs was secured at the expense of poorer households. It was a system that preserved lineages while often deepening hardship elsewhere. The bond between nurse and child could be profound. Some infants, especially in noble households, formed closer attachments to their wet nurses than to their own mothers, who remained distant by duty or custom. Records tell of wet nurses remembered in wills or honored with lifelong connections. In these rare cases, their care was acknowledged openly, though far more often their names were forgotten, their contribution fading into the margins of history. In remembering them now, I see wet nurses as silent pillars of medieval survival. Their milk preserved heirs, sustained peasants' children, and filled the gap left by death in childbirth. Yet their role also reveals the imbalance of power, where women's bodies were demanded and directed for the sake of others. They were both indispensable and overlooked, a testament to the quiet sacrifices upon which so many lives depended in that age. Long before parchment captured words, memories passed through the spoken voice. Mothers, grandmothers, and neighbors carried the stories of childbirth, repeating them to daughters as warnings and lessons. These were not tales meant to frighten for sport, but to prepare, for every girl grew up knowing she would face the same peril. Oral tradition kept alive the names of women who perished, their fates woven into the fabric of community memory. In these retellings, the past lived on in whispered truths. In cottages, such stories were told by the hearth, often at night when work was done. A girl might hear how her own mother was nearly lost in labor, saved only by the intervention of a midwife or the prayers of the village. Others would recount the silent funerals of neighbors, reminding listeners that survival was never guaranteed. These stories were as much part of upbringing as learning to spin wool or bake bread. They shaped expectation long before womanhood. Among nobles, the pattern was no different, though the setting grander. Daughters of queens and duchesses were told of their mothers' ordeals, often in letters or courtly accounts. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself spoke of the dangers of repeated childbearing. Her words carried into the education of her children. Such warnings, though cloaked in formality, carried the same weight, that noble blood did not free one from the shadow of childbed. Even queens became lessons in mortality. The oral stories carried more than fear. They also preserved the rituals of survival. Midwives passed along chants, herbal recipes, and gestures through spoken teaching, often never written down. A knot tied a certain way, a phrase whispered at a crucial moment, a mixture of herbs brewed with care. These details lived in memory, carried from one generation to the next. Such traditions created continuity, a fragile inheritance against the uncertainty of birth. Songs too played their part, lamentations sung at funerals or after tragic births. These laments became part of collective memory, their verses shaping how communities understood both suffering and endurance. Even when words changed, their tone carried sorrow from one generation to another. In this way, music became oral history, preserving emotions as well as events. Women grew up not only hearing of danger, but feeling it through melody and rhythm. The repetition of such stories fostered a sense of shared fate. A young bride entering her first pregnancy did not imagine herself alone, but as part of a long chain of women who had walked this path before. The memory of mothers lost, sisters saved, and neighbors buried became her companions. This collective inheritance gave both warning and strength. Through memory, fear was shared, but so too was endurance. In the absence of written testimony from most women, oral tradition stands as their truest record. While chronicles focused on kings and wars, village voices remembered the daily battles of childbirth. The spoken word ensured these experiences were not lost, even when no scribe considered them worthy of ink. They reveal a history kept alive not by books, but by memory, by the insistence of mothers that their daughters know the truth. When I reflect upon these generational stories, I hear a chorus of voices stretching across centuries. They remind us that history was not only recorded in manuscripts, but breathed in kitchens, sung in laments, and whispered at bedsides. Oral tradition carried the wisdom, sorrow, and resilience of women who endured what records often ignored. Their voices, though never inscribed, remain etched in time, shaping the memory of an age where childbirth defined the rhythm of life and death. The dangers of childbirth left marks not only upon the bodies of women, but upon the very structure of medieval life. Generations grew up in the knowledge that bringing forth life meant stepping close to death. This reality shaped how families formed, how marriages were arranged, and how communities braced themselves for loss. It was not a distant possibility, but a certainty that hovered over every household, a presence woven into the rhythm of existence. Religion absorbed this shadow deeply. Sermons reminded women that pain in labor was part of divine punishment, while saints were lifted as intercessors to soften the ordeal. Prayers to Saint Margaret, blessings of relics, and emergency baptisms became daily expressions of this reality. Faith was a source of comfort, but it also reinforced the inevitability of suffering. The Church framed childbirth not merely as biology, but as theology, ensuring its shadow reached both body and soul. The fear shaped politics as well, for dynasties depended upon heirs. The death of a queen in childbed might alter alliances or fracture kingdoms, shifting the balance of power across Europe. Monarchs remarried swiftly, not only for companionship, but for lineage. Thrones trembled on the edge of every birth, as much at risk in the chamber as on the battlefield. The survival of rulers was tied directly to the survival of the women who bore their children. Art and literature carried the memory forward, embedding childbirth into the cultural fabric of the age. Manuscripts depicted mothers in bed, plays dramatized saintly interventions, and laments sang of mothers lost. These expressions ensured that the shadow of childbirth was never hidden, but acknowledged openly. They reflect a society that could not escape the reality of loss, and so made meaning of it through image, song, and story. The impact extended into family life, where stepmothers, orphaned children, and widowers became common features of society. Families were reshaped again and again by maternal mortality, creating patterns of remarriage and blended households. Childhood itself was marked by these losses, with many growing up in the absence of their birth mothers. The shadow fell across every generation, leaving scars upon kinship and memory alike. Archaeology confirms what chronicles and oral stories preserve. Graves of young women, often with infants at their side, fill churchyards from England to Italy. Their bones tell of malnutrition, disease, and the strain of repeated pregnancies. Each burial is a story untold, yet together they reveal the scale of suffering. The shadow of childbirth is etched into the earth itself, a reminder that mortality shaped not only individuals, but the very demographic landscape of medieval Europe. Even today, echoes of that shadow linger. Modern medicine has lifted much of the danger, yet the memory of centuries past shapes how we view motherhood, suffering, and endurance. The resilience of women who bore children despite fear stands as one of history's quietest yet most profound legacies. Their endurance, though often unrecorded, sustained societies through famine, war, and plague. The shadow was long, but it was carried with courage. When I sit now by the fire and recall those centuries, I see that the story of medieval childbirth is not only one of sorrow, but of survival. The shadow that fell across Europe shaped faith, politics, art, and memory. To remember it is to honor the countless women whose silent endurance made life itself possible. Their struggles remind us that history is written not only in battles and crowns, but in the fragile and perilous act of birth.